Welcome to the Plant Spirit Podcast on connecting with plant consciousness and the healing wisdom of nature. If you'd like to learn more on how to communicate directly with plants, visit www.learnplantlanguage.com to register for the free workshop. That's www.learnplantlanguage.com. I'm your host, Sara Artemisia, and I'm deeply honored to introduce our next guest to the show today. Sam Coffman is a clinical herbalist, teacher, and founder of Herbal Medics Academy. He began his medical education as a Special Forces or Green Beret medic and has taught herbalism for over 30 years. Sam founded and runs Herbal Medics Academy, also known as the Human Path, which offers 4 primary programs: clinical herbalism, austere medicine, advanced medicine making, and family herbalism. So Sam, thank you so much for being here. Just such an honor to have you join us today.
Hi, Sara. I feel blessed to be here as well. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just so excited for our chat today and the many layers and ways that you work with plants. And I'd love to actually start there. And if you'd be open to sharing a bit about your experience in specifically, how has your journey through so many different aspects of working in the military, with language, Western medicine, and also TCM really shaped your relationship with the earth?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's the overlying or the overarching kind of concept in my life is just that my life has always had a purpose to it of some type, right? The things that I'm doing now, for instance, with TCM, they started for me when I was 13 years old. I remember I was really into martial arts, and as much as my parents hated that because I was actually a classical pianist to start at the age of 5, and I won all these different like state competitions and I actually became a jazz pianist for a period of time for a living and have a couple of CDs out for posterity's sake from that period of my life. But at the time, I was into the idea of martial arts, and not just from the standpoint of fighting, but really from the standpoint of the philosophy behind it. I remember getting a copy of the Tao Te Ching from the library, and I found a book on Kung Fu that had all these these Qigong exercises in it. So I was doing Qigong exercises at the age of 13. When I think back on it, that's all come first full circle to when I finally, after all these other things I did in my life, I was ready to and able to go to TCM school, get my MSAOM and so forth, and become a licensed acupuncturist / TCM herbalist. And that was where, when I first started working in the acupuncture clinics, my internships and stuff, it was like, oh yeah, all that work I did with Qi, that I did. And that took me through Special Forces, through the assessment and selection phase, which is they're trying to read out, all the way through the qualification phase. I'd get up, with the exception of maybe during med lab when we had less than 4 hours of sleep a night. For the most part, I would get up early and just do, even if it was just, and even then, even with 4 hours of sleep, I would wake up and I would take about like 18 breaths in my bed, before I'd even open my eyes, I'd breathe. So my point to that is that the overarching concept of plant medicine, of a connection to the earth, of a connection to plants, and all the things I've done, has never been a disparate set of, looking back on it, it's never been a disparate set of tasks, that I accomplished, even with all the different things I've done, right? But all of that is absolutely a part of who I am today. And all of that is a part of plants and plant medicine. More importantly, my relationship to the earth. What is the earth and why are we here? What are humans for? What is our purpose here as a species? And I believe over the years, what's come to me is that we are here, if we make it as a species, to be almost like the CNS or maybe even the cerebral cortex of the planet in a way that relates to working with the planet as a protective species, as being able to understand nature, both in its what we think of as cruelty and its love, whether that's really what it is or not, but what we think of it as, as we put all our human emotions in there, and being able to just connect and be a part of that in a way that fulfills our purpose as a species here. So that's a whole nother rabbit hole that we literally could talk about for the podcast and way beyond, but that's kind of the overarching piece of my life, I think, that connects me to plant medicine.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. And I'm curious to hear if there are any particular plants or maybe even just a few plants that you could share with us, some stories of your experience with plant connection that you've had over your life.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I mentioned to you earlier, and it's in my book in the prologue, I think, or the introduction or whatever, talking about how I broke my thumb at the start of the most strenuous and difficult part of the Special Forces qualification course as a medic, which is called GOAT Lab or Med Lab, and how I broke my thumb as an avulsion fracture and how I basically healed it by using Comfrey and Horsetail. And I got through the course with a broken thumb that healed while I was going through the course. And that was really like my trial by fire with herbs when I was first really understanding herbal medicine to some extent. And so from them, many, many, many clinical stories, of course, over the years and the thousands of people I've worked with as clients or patients and through today. But I think that the most important stories for me as such are not always stories necessarily of healing even, but just of connection. One plant that stands out to me a lot is Datura. I've always loved Datura, all the species that I've known of Datura that have grown. And when we lived in Central Texas, the Datura that grew there in our yard and just wild and just came up and we had Datura all over the place. And it's the only plant that I ever did an actual flower essence of. And I remember making a flower essence, a moon essence out of a Datura flower, which is the most incredible flower and scent, I think, of any plant almost for me. And just having these lucid dreams for about 3 nights, and it was probably, I'm sure there was some psychotropic activity in that too, but I felt so connected to the plant from then on and meditating with the plant. And it went through. So this particular story kind of illustrates how you can think you know something and maybe you don't. And we were at my wife and I were at hot springs in southern New Mexico, Fayetteville Hot Springs once, and this was like maybe 2 years after that kind of experience with Datura. And we're just sitting there, and it's a full moon. It's beautiful out, and we noticed that in the moon we can see there's this beautiful Datura that's in bloom that we hadn't noticed when we came in from a different side. And so we're sitting there in the hot springs, naked, and it's midnight, or not midnight, but it's late at night, and the moon's up. I'm like, oh my God. And I jump out of the hot springs and run over her. And I can just feel the Datura going, get away from me, right? Get away from me, like cussing at me, like, get away from me. And I'm like, what? What the hell? We know each other. And it's telling me, no, you don't know. You know my sister. You don't know me. And I'm like, oh, well, guess what? This attitude, I'm human. And if I want to smell your flower, I will smell, So I lean down and I'm smelling the flower. It's, of course, amazing. I stand up and there was this mesquite tree right above my head that I hadn't even really noticed. The branch was low. And this thorn on the mesquite tree just like ripped a furrow in my scalp from one end to the other. I'm like, so I was bleeding down in my eyes. And I can hear this Datura going, I told you. And I was just like, all right, I guess I don't know you, whatever. But it's, the relationships we have that we form through this linguistic bond, or the sense of a language that there's no way we can describe that with a physical human language, but they exist. And there's a telepathic or a mental connection that we form with the plants. And anybody who's done this and has meditated with plants at all knows this. You felt it. And the cool thing about intuition and that world and the dream world and all those things is the more you trust it, the better you get at it. The more you use it, the better you get at it. And so it's just a question of practice, really, more than anything. And once you start to trust it, you realize this is real. It's not just something that's made up,
Amazing. Yeah, so much in what you just shared there. That aspect of how, when we think we know something, there's probably another layer in there that we don't know, that the plants are constantly showing us that what you just shared about how the relationship that we have formed, that there's a linguistic bond there, but it might not be in the same way that we form words in our human to human relationships. And that aspect of the practice piece, that it's similar to exercise or any kind of mindfulness practice or anything, that the more we do it, the easier it becomes. That connecting with plants is the same thing. That's amazing that you just shared that. Thank you. And any other plant stories coming to mind? I just love this, what you just shared.
Of course, around like seeing how incredible a plant is at working with a body. I think probably one of the biggest, even though I've had some really incredible clinical stories, I could say, of things that were horrible chronic cases or even acute cases and infections, but one that really spoke to me loudly was when I first started really doing a lot of research on snake venom and snake bites. And I really got into it. I mean, I was very interested in the concept of hyaluronidase and some of the different proteins in venom that break down our own extracellular matrix. They break down our tissue and allow venom to move, the actual venomous portion of venom, which is probably less than 5% of most snake venoms. So one of the herbs that, of course, I was fascinated by was Echinacea, in particular Echinacea angustifolia root, having these alkylamides that are very inhibiting to hyaluronidase which is an enzyme in the snake venom, particular rattlesnake venom in this case. And I was teaching a wilderness first responder course, and also in New Mexico, in southern New Mexico, down by the Gila in the hot springs there. And Michael Cottingham, if you know him, he's an herbalist down in that area. And it was his class, but he wanted to do the WFR. So he had me come in, and probably 70% of the class was his students, and about 30% were my students that showed up. It was a huge class, a 10-day course. And we pull in, my wife and I pull in, and David, who is he's now an instructor of ours too. And at this dog, a student had just gotten there, and their dog had just been bitten by a rattler, like literally like within a minute from the time we pulled in, it had just happened. And this dog had moved at the time. And so the rattlesnake bite was not just puncture wounds, but also like a laceration above its eye. And it was envenomated. You could tell it was a full envenomation bite because his face, within a minute, his face was swollen up, like the eyes were it just looked like somebody had just taken a pump and started inflating this poor dog's head. It was just lying there with tongue laying out, couldn't even breathe. And immediately, Echinacea angustifolia, Michael had some too. We grabbed it. We had a student cut open a prickly pear pad and get the needles off and start cutting that open. And we just started working with it. So because it was a partial laceration, we could drip the Echinacea angustifolia into the wound itself. And so we did that and just let it drip in, and just like tiny drops. Of course, it's mostly alcohol, so had to be really careful. It was about a 60-pound dog, but we could still rip a little bit into its mouth and so we did that sublingually. And not even 10 minutes later, the dog starts to kind of thump its tail. And then within a half an hour, it's standing and it's kind of wagging its tail. So anyway, we continued that treatment between that and prickly pear pads. The owner of the dog worked with the dog for all night, or at least until like 2 a.m. or so. Next morning, the dog was totally normal, except for the fact that all of the swelling around his throat looked like it had goiter. All the swelling was now around his throat, around his lymph. Face was not swollen at all. You could still see the laceration, but otherwise almost no swelling on the tail at all. Behavior was totally fine. I mean, almost no swelling in the face. And then we started just working with some lymph movers with the dog. And 3 days later, it was like nothing had ever even happened. And so, again, these little things that you see, not necessarily even because that's something that may be that big of a striking of a story by itself, but given inside of the cultural aspect of what we consider to be the medicine, quote unquote, here for rattlesnake bites, which, if you think about it, is one of those areas that never has been deprogrammed over the last century. So if you think about it, really, pharmaceutical medicine started programming what it is and what herbalism was not, supposedly, in this sort of propaganda. Now, I'm not saying that this is necessarily intentional, even. It just happened. Well, maybe it's intentional. But if you go back to the Flexner reports, 1910 or so, with being a gateway to be able to say herbalism isn't real and herbs aren't real. And until the really kind of a renaissance of them around the 60s, and then going way into kind of, woo land about it, and not really being, it's taken a long time to kind of come back around and be actually physically manifested. Clinical herbalism is starting to be something now. And I started this back when you had to look over your shoulder all the time because somebody could, FDA or whoever was going to be a problem for that. So anyway, my point is, rattlesnake bites and rattlesnake venom is something that never has been deprogrammed out of that, and it's anti-venom or nothing. And if you're into wilderness medicine, which I very much am, then of course, if I'm teaching a WFR, the last thing in the world that I would ever do is tell somebody in a classic WFR, yeah, you can use herbs. I can't do that. I would never do that. It's take care of them, make sure they're rid of anything constricting, get them to higher care, get them to anti-venom. And so to be able to experience how effective that was. I had experienced for copperhead bites, but never for rattlesnake bite to see. And it was a dog, not a human, but that was still incredible to witness that.
That is incredible. Thank you so much for sharing that. Just really highlighting the power of herbs and how quickly and effectively they can support the healing process. Kind of on a related note, I'm curious to hear a bit more about, how do you approach complex clinical cases in your work?
Yes, that's a great question. And that's something that's changed for me a lot over the years. So I've always had this approach that because of the fact that we run clinics, especially in underserved areas, free clinics, and sometimes I'll see 100 people in a day, and it'll be a small team of people, myself and enough students to be able to run an apothecary in a clinic. And I'll rotate through tables, so like 3 tables, one at a time, and I'll spend no more than 15 minutes at any given table where the students have already done the initial intake. And so how do you approach a complex case where all you have is maybe 15 or 20 minutes to work with somebody, because you've got a lot of people standing in line that you still got to see, and you want them to come back? Well, the way I used to do always, and this hasn't changed substantially, but was, what can I do that's going to help this person enough to where they're going to come back in a week or 2 weeks and say, wow, that's working. So I usually would go at, the approach would be dealing with these more superficial symptomologies that you can affect with herbs, and at the same time being aware of the fact that there's much deeper stuff going on. So like peeling away the layer of an onion of sort has always been, because I really feel strongly that you're not treating somebody with herbs at all until you've done at least one follow-up or two, at least, and multiple is better. So more complex has changed since I have become educated in traditional Chinese medicine, working with Chinese herbs from an energetic standpoint, as opposed to how I was doing it before, which was very Western, bioscience kind of approach that I was using a lot of Chinese herb with for that, which also works that way. But now I kind of have two interspersing layers. One is the Western symptomology, and then the more functional medicine, Western deep. And then somewhere in there, in between those two, is sort of the TCM, what they would call the branch, as opposed to the root, the branch of what's going on. So more of a symptomology based. But from a TCM perspective, there's a little difference in there. And then below everything, the more TCM perspective on what's going on there from an energetic standpoint. And the reason I got to that was because a lot of these complex cases, especially what I think is an epidemic in our country, is perimenopausal women between 40 and 60 years old, unexplained and unlosable weight gain and just can't change it, blood sugar issues, thyroid issues, cortisol and stress issues, of course, progesterone, being a precursor, cortisol being a part of that as well. And approaching it from a Western standpoint was like playing whack-a-mole with hormones. It's like, oh, well, let's work with the thyroid. Oh, well, let's work with cortisol. Or that, and one thing will pop up after it's just not. It's not the way. It's not the way to do it in any, even if you're using pharmaceuticals either, of course. But then I started finding there's these, when I first started my internship in the clinic, working particularly with this one woman from China with 40 years experience as an acupuncturist, and she was treating these cases that I would consider like these complex, what I'm saying is an epidemic, women coming in with these issues. She's treating them like they were low-hanging fruit, like, oh yeah, that's no problem. We just do this and blah, blah, blah. We'll do this and do this. And they're coming back like the next week saying, yeah, that's working really good. And my, blah, blah, blah. And in a month, they're like, yeah, my blood work's looking better on this. And I'm just like, oh my God, what, there's something here. So really understanding that there is a balance system in the body, that when you start to get to really complex issues like endocrine disorders, you cannot possibly get to the actual root of the problem through the hormones themselves. You have to go beneath that to the actual human, what do you want to call it? The human structure. And by structure, I mean, we call it energetics, but what is it really? One of the things I teach in one of our beginning courses is that there's 3 rings that you can think of health from. And one of the outer is spiritual. And by that, I don't necessarily mean a religion, but the spiritual. The next in is energetic, and the third in is physical. Physical being what we do in allopathic medicine every day. Energetic being maybe what we would see more a lot of times in maybe Ayurvedic and a TCM approach. And then spiritual being a lot of times what we might see more in, say, some different indigenous types of medicine. I was in Nicaragua for a period of time, a very short period of time, working with an herbalist there, who asked me, it is an example, he lives in a jungle and learned from the indigenous folks on that side of Nicaragua. And he once asked me about the like suicide and depression and all the different, and anxiety and PTSD and bipolar and all the different, he didn't know the names for them, but just like I hear all the time about all these different like psychological issues there. And, what do you think about those? And we were talking about it. And so his impression was, I think that's spiritual. Those are spiritual diseases because they're not rooted to the earth. And if they were rooted, an initial rooting to the earth, then they would be able to work through what their purpose is and so forth. And so maybe that's one example of like a spiritual approach. Just a lot of people are like, well, what do you mean by spiritual? So that's one way of looking at it. And I think there are many different paradigms to look at health from. all of them have their value. None of them are, I would never say that pharmaceutical medicine doesn't have any value. Of course it does in a certain way, but they have their limitations. And so I think the more paradigms that we can use and look at something from different angles, like anything in life, the more that you can do that, the quote unquote wiser you become about it. That's what we consider wisdom, is somebody who has the experience and the failures, the history of failure enough in certain things to be able to say, oh yeah, that didn't work, or this didn't work, at least to be able to put it together and say, well, this is sort of like what I use now as my best practice structure to be able to get through this when I'm looking at it at 3 or 4 different angles. And I think that's the same thing with health very much.
Well, that is incredible. Thank you so much for sharing that. I love what you were just sharing at the end there about how there are many different paradigms to look at health and medicine. There's many different angles that we can approach an issue from. And I think this really speaks to your integrative approach and how you work with plants, how you work with medicine and healing, and particularly because so much of your work is focused in wilderness medicine, wilderness first aid. I'd love to hear your perspective on why is it really important for people to know wilderness medicine and wilderness first aid right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think even if the world didn't end tomorrow, even if we don't have a zombie apocalypse, and I'm saying that only half jokingly, we still become better at medicine if we understand the true world we live in. This goes back to what I first started talking about, just being connected to the earth, right? When you turn on the light, it's not magic that the light bulb turns on. When you turn the water on, that water comes from somewhere and it goes to somewhere. Understanding those aspects of life is critical, and to not take them for granted. In my opinion, you can't be an effective healer, let's say, working with medicine that is living medicine that comes from the earth without understanding the roots of what that means. And to me, what that means is knowing how to deal with the worst case scenarios and be the best possible human in those worst situations. So yes, absolutely. When I first started this 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago, 1989, when I first started my journey into special forces, I remember sitting there and just kind of hanging out with some of the other guys that we were getting ready, training up to be able to get through the assessment selection course. And out of everybody sitting in the room, one person said, why are you here? And the conversation started to turn, and people were saying, I just feel like something's going to happen, some really big thing's going to happen, and I want to be prepared for it. So that was 1989, and people were there. And then granted, most of the people, the reason we had problems was because of human behavior. It wasn't even the hurricane that was the issue. It was the human behavior that was the issue. It was people making a run on all the gas stations so you couldn't get gas anywhere. There was plenty of gas, but everybody made a run on it. So any situation that we have is multiplied on a geometric scale, really, by human behavior. Knowing that and just understanding that's a reality that we live in this country, at least in this culture, should be a good reason to want to learn wilderness first aid and not just first aid, but wilderness first aid. And the way I teach it is really, I call them sticks and rags course. Like, I want you to know the principles and how to do this with literally sticks and rags if you have to, because from there you can always buy the gear and know how to, the gear is easy to use. But once you know that, the principles behind it. So I think that makes you a better overall person as any kind of healer. It doesn't matter if I don't care if you're homeopath or if you're just using only energetic medicine and flower remedies or whatever, you're still going to be a better at it if you have that basic understanding and link to the earth and to humanity in its bare form, and not just mass hallucination that we all agree on to be reality right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we certainly saw that with the human behavior piece at the beginning of the pandemic, with every single store running out of toilet paper, and the issue had nothing to do with the actual physical issue had nothing to do with anything related to that. So yeah, thanks for highlighting that, just how important that is. I'm curious to hear a bit more about Herbal Medics Academy. Could you tell us a bit more about that, the 4 different programs that you work with there?
Absolutely. And of course, we have lots of one-off type programs as well, not programs, but courses everywhere, that are great too, for people just want to pop in and get a 2-hour course here or there. We have makers workshops once a month on all kinds of different stuff. But generally speaking, we have 4 areas that we concentrate on, and one of clinical herbalism being one of them, which also kind of corresponds to some degree with people that want to get their registration from the American Herbalist Guild. We offer a full spectrum of not just didactic, that covers everything and more than the AHG wants, but also the clinical hours and more than the AHG wants. And this is teaching students how to become better clinicians, how to become herbal clinicians, and if they want to have their own practice, at some point. The second area is advanced medicine making, or we call it the apothecaries program. And it's because there are just so many, herbalism is so much more complex than Western medicine, right? I mean, I got into med school when I was 42, when I was kind of given up on the school idea. And as it turned out, I walked away from it due to family and financial reasons. And that was what started me on the current school that you see now. The whole idea of allopathic medicine is based upon pharmaceutical medicine. And when I started learning that, and I was like, oh my gosh, I get it now. All the physiology I'm learning is just basically reverse engineered pharmaceutical pathways and why we're learning it that way. Then I started realizing there's no medical, I was just talking about healing paradigms. There's no healing paradigm that doesn't have its main factor that it has to be there in order for it to be successful. And with herbalism, obviously, is plants. So what that means is you have to not just learn botany and how to identify plants and making sure you have the right plant, but you need to know how to harvest them the right time and what it is. You need to know how to make medicine from them the right way. Not just, everything's a maceration tincture. There are multiple ways to be able to extract plants, and then administration is a part of that as well. So really, that's what the apothecaries, the advanced medicine making, is not just. It's very much, making medicine, but also making medicine in ways that administer it in ways that we're not used to, and we're not, nebulizing them, and nasal atomization, and being able to administer them through the literally dozens of different ways we can administer them to the human body, depending on how we get the herb to the tissue. And then the third area is family medicine, which also has doula certification. It has emergency birth is involved. It's pediatric medicine. It's prenatal. It's postpartum. It's birth. And it's run by an amazing midwife herbalist named Katia Limon, who also is helped by Mel Bailey, who's also a nurse midwife. And they run an incredible program there. She wrote a chapter out of in my book as well. I asked her to because of that as well, emergency birth. And the fourth area is austere medicine, which is the kind of graduate level of the WFA and WFR kind of stuff. It's like WFR gets you up to the point where you get somebody to higher care. What if there is no higher care? And that's where I teamed up with Dr. Steve Pearson, MD, who also used to be he started out as a Green Beret medic as well, about 10 years before I did. And he's been a doctor for like 35 years in rural Utah. And so we together created the curriculum for how to work with acute, even chronic to some extent, but acute and trauma in the field, in a prolonged field care environment, austere medicine where there's no higher care, and we have to deal with these. So what we do in one of our programs where they're on site here, it's a 13-day program after they've done a whole bunch of stuff, first didactic online, where part of it is a 3-day WFR certification. They've already done a WFA and an advanced WFA. And so we take that 9 days and break it into 3, and they do it at the 3 days on site with the WFR. At the end of that, some of the same scenarios, the same issues that they're dealing with in a WFR, now it's like the same scenario is there, same post-disaster situation, but guess what? There's no higher care, and now we have to take care of them. So that's where we get into the austere, and that's where Steve comes in. And so we're doing all kinds of incredible scenario-based, teaching them basic medical procedures, field surgery type stuff that is post-disaster related. Like if there's no higher care, nobody else can do it. At least if you couldn't assist somebody in doing this, you might have to do some of it yourself. And we're talking basic stuff in the field, but things that you're going to have to know how to do to breed wounds, and even can you do an amputation if you had to? Can you deal with a sucking chest wound if you had to? How are these things? And you're not going to create a doctor in a 13-day program, but on-site program, but you're going to at least get people comfortable with the fact that they can take care of a minor wound that's become infected. And so we approach it both from an allopathic and, of course, an herbal perspective as well. If we are trying to, for instance, limit and ration the pharmaceuticals that we have on hand, how much can we deal with herbs to begin with? So that's the austere medicine program. So those are the 4 programs.
Well, that is amazing. So comprehensive, so multifaceted. Thank you so much for doing that work. It's so powerful and really so needed. And I love how it builds this experience of resiliency, of how to be self-reliant in an emergency, and really how you're weaving plants into every single aspect of that in your work. Just absolutely amazing. And you mentioned your book there a little bit too. I was curious if you could tell us more about that, your book, Herbal Medic, and also any other books that you're currently working on.
Yeah, sure. Herbal Medic I actually had a self-published version of it from 10 years ago or so that I wrote to be a sort of a textbook of the austere program to begin with and the WFR. I used to call the WHFR, the Wilderness Herbal First Responder, at that time, because I was incorporating extra days of just, there was a WFR portion and there was an herbal portion. And now that grew into the austere medicine. Well, Story Publishing took that, gave me a contract on it, and I rewrote and expanded and did a whole bunch more stuff with it, well edited by them. And they turned it into, in my opinion, a really good book. It's their third bestseller last year, Story Publishing. It's doing really, really well. It's something that there's no other book like it, in my opinion, out there that talks about, it starts with first aid, wilderness first aid stuff, and then starts getting into herbs and, of course, some medicine making, and it's got a materia medica. But then how do we work with herbs, all these different areas, and how do I formulate? What is my approach to be able to deal with something like strep throat in the field or at home or whatever, wherever you're dealing with it? Even red flag situations that normally go to higher care, I get into there. Of course, it was finished it in the spring that COVID started, so I've even got some COVID stuff in there as well. So that's that book. I have two other books on contract with them right now. One of them is called Survival Gardening, and that'll be out next year. I'm not sure. It might not be out until 2025. They usually try to put the gardening books out like January, February, so it might be 2025. And then that's everything we would need to do to be able to grow our food and survive off of our garden, right? And if we need enough fats and proteins, and this includes backyard agriculture to some extent as well, rabbitry and chickens, but primarily, how can we do this with the food we're growing, and how can we do it? So I kind of had this approach of like, how can we get nutrition that we can actually eat in 5 days, using sprouts and such? How about in 5 weeks? How about in 5 months? And how about in 5 years? And kind of looking at it from that perspective, because of course, real gardening, you've got to build soil and you're doing all these things that are going to take, seasons, if not years, to be able to really create. But how can we speed that process up and get nutrition out of our garden to be able to live on? And then the third book is also, it's sort of like a primitive engineering program. It's a water collection, water storage, water purification. So like slow sand filtration for like community level, where we're not talking about, going out and buying pumps and stuff. We may not have any electricity at all. How can we do this? How can we work with gravity and with water and with slow sand filtration to be able to do that, and hygiene as well. And then also hygiene in general. So that's what that third book is. And I have many other books on the way, with your story or otherwise, that are specifically going to be herbal medicine related to advanced medicine making and clinical case studies, written together with Dr. Kyla Helm, MD, who is also on our faculty and teaches. Together, we teach the Botanical Functional Medicine course, which is part of our clinical program as well.
Amazing. Well, I really look forward to reading those books. Just incredible, the information that you're packing in there. Thank you so much for sharing that. And clearly you work with the plants in so many different realms and ways of support for people. And I'm curious if you could tell us a bit about how the plants really support you in your life's work.
Yeah, I definitely have kind of a meditative aspect of connecting to this land now that we've moved up here to Taos in the mountains, where I feel back at home, in the mountains. And it's actually the same range, the Sangre de Cristos, but on the southern side of it, that I've spent a lot of time in when I lived in Colorado and grew up in Colorado. So being here and connecting to the earth in a meditative way every day, just being able to walk and talk to the trees and talk to the plants and listen to the plants has been a huge part of that for me my whole life. But here, I feel like it's really finally coming full circle for me to be able to be in this environment every day. It's incredible. That's probably the biggest way. I think that incorporating some sort of a daily, call it a practice for lack of a better word, that you just, that you do every day. We're back to the whole idea of, if you use your intuition, the more you use it, the better you get at it. Having some form of that, I think, will help steer you. And if you listen to your intuition, this is a message I would say, I get asked this all the time, like, what do you suggest if a person wants to start out learning herbs? Well, you got to learn fundamentals, right? You need to learn some basic fundamentals that are actually useful and not just made up copy paste information, but actual empirical data. In other words, data that is related to hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of people and patients. This is why I like TCM, even though, of course, it went through its own changes, massive changes, but at least there's a history of these things working. And when I see these formulas and these herbs, and it's like, wow, this is interesting because I use the herbs the same way, but from a different perspective. And this is why they actually may work. And you see all those things intertwining. So empirically, how do these plants work? And how can we show that? You need those fundamentals to start with, of course. Not that that's the only thing you should be doing, but it's a part of it. And I think you need to learn just basic botany and some botanical names at least. And, all our students have to, all our apothecaries are always set up by genus and species, right? I mean, alphabetically. So that's how we organize our plants always. And so people at least have an idea of what they're working with, let alone families. But beyond that, you need to have an intuitive relationship to the plants. It's a lot like music or language, right? I mean, if you learn a language, you learn a foreign language, well, you have to know some grammar. You have to, or you're not going to be intelligible, right? You can't, if you don't know how to speak in past tense or future tense, or you don't understand plural versus singular of a verb form or something, a conjugation, you'll never really be able to communicate very well. But as you learn that, you still have to say things, right? And as the things you're saying aren't going to always be, can you tell me where the bathroom is? They're going to be thoughts and ideas and philosophies. Same with music. I mean, of course, again, my background was classical music until I got to high school. I started getting into jazz and became a jazz musician. Well, to me, that was everything. It was like all the technique and theory that I had, which was way advanced, for my age, because I was put into these situations of very strict kind of theoretical and technical practice to where I had really a lot of good technique and knew the theory, but none of that mattered. Once I hit jazz, it was like, well, now how do you actually make music on the spot? Like, you can take a piece and you can improvise through it. And and maybe you can read the chord changes, in a real book or whatever for a tune that everybody else is playing in the band. But at some point, it's not just little blues riffs. At some point, it has to actually be music that's coming somewhere from inside of you or through you out into the keys, right? And so, or whatever you were using for your instrument. Same thing with plant medicine. At some point, you have to learn some of the basic technique stuff, but at some point, there's going to be an actual language. There's going to be a song. There's going to be a sentence. There's going to be an idea, a concept that's going to come through you. It's going to lead you in a certain way, and you have to trust and follow that, because it is a living medicine. It's not a dead medicine. It's not chemistry. Chemistry is part of life, but it's not broken into pharmaceutical single constituent chemical, synthetic chemical, or anything like that. And I'm not even saying that those are necessarily bad. Those are all still part of the universe, right? Like how does that saying go? If you really want to create an apple pie from scratch, you got to start by creating the universe, right? I mean, it's all part of nature, but the human part that we link to and the living medicine, these plants are alive. They have consciousness, and to be able to connect to that and trust to that, that's the portion of it that you get better and better at. And the more technique you have, the more you can talk. The more language, the more grammar the better sentences, the way you can talk about. Yeah, I can talk about the meaning of life, right? I mean, I was a German linguist and I worked as a translator, and I was fluent. I still am fluent, but I was native fluent. I spoke no English for 3 years once I got over there, and I had a knack for languages, always had an ear for it. And I mean, people didn't know I was not German, right? But there's levels to what I could talk about, right? I mean, funny because I had all this musical background, but I couldn't talk about music in German because I never really learned that language. I didn't learn it. It was a totally different vocabulary and words that I didn't really get around and work with. So I couldn't express myself in that area at all about that. But there were other areas I could, and I loved philosophy, and I read a lot of German philosophy, and I read all of read tons of that type of thing. And so I could talk about that in German very well, because I had the tools, the technique, but I also had the intuitive link between who I am, inside, and what I wanted to express outside.
Well, thank you, Sam. So incredible. Just so incredible. And I love that you brought in language and music, and how it's the same exact thing when we're working with plant medicine. And that really hits such a core foundational piece of the why of this podcast, of really, what does it mean to learn the language of plants from many different ways, many different angles, many different layers? So you have certainly connected with multiple of those layers and angles today. And so just so grateful for you, for your work, for being here. And so tell us, how can people find out more about you and your work?
Sure, yeah. So herbalmedics.academy or thehumanpath.net. Anything that with the word herbal medic and Sam Coffman, you're going to come up with us. I mean, we're all over the web. We're all over social media and Facebook. Herbal Medics, Herbal Medics Sam on Instagram. I post on there at least every day. I mean, on TikTok, I don't really do much there, but I have some videos there. youtube.com/The Human Path. So if you're looking for either of those two things, you're going to find us. Herbal Medic is the name of my book. You can find it on Amazon all over the place and read the reviews if you want. Of course, you can find it in our store. I have a store and a botanical formulary as well. It's called herbalfirstaidgear.com, herbalfirstaidgear.com. That started as being a formulary for doctors and nurse practitioners that wanted to be able to order my stuff. So that's where it started, and it's just grown so much that it's really its own thing now, and it's really nice. It's a nice little online store. We've got tons of formulas. Some of them are still a little bit cryptic because at the time I would have like a whole PDF I'd send to the docs and say, this is what they were. So I didn't want to even deal with FDA GMP naming regulations, and so they were cryptic. So some of them still are, and that haven't been renamed into nice GMP safe names yet. But in general, you can find lots and lots of different formulas on there, both topical and of course mostly internal.
Well, thanks so much, Sam. And thanks so much for joining us on the podcast today. Just such an honor to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Sara. It was really nice to be able to talk with you, and it was fun. Thank you.
And thanks so much for listening and joining us today on the Plant Spirit Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, and please follow to subscribe, leave a review, and look forward to seeing you on the next episode.